Well, hello and welcome back to Walking the Talk, the sermon podcast of Creekside Community Church in San Leandro, California, where we help you live out what we talked about on Sunday. My name is Jeff Bruce. I'm one of the pastors here, joined by other pastors here, Max Butler, pastor of worship, John Bruce, my dad, the founding pastor. Guys, how are you doing?
Doing great.
Good. I'm convicted because I did not walk my talk right before this podcast after upbraiding our people for not praying more before doing things. Failed to pray before the podcast. So, Dad, I appreciate that reminder. I don't know if I upbraided them, but made a strong plea.
You never upbraid people.
For abiding in Christ by praying before we do things, and then summarily failed to do that before we started the podcast.
Yeah. Did you mention, maybe I heard this somewhere else, was it Calvin who said that walking by faith is first of all praying for things?
He said prayer is the chief exercise
that's
of faith.
Yeah. That was a great quote.
It's a helpful one.
Yeah. I'm glad you didn't do it in French.
Yeah. I like to read Calvin in the original French usually to really get so much more out of it. Well, I don't read French, nor are we talking about the sermon we just did, because we are playing catch up this week and continuing to catch up on some previous sermons. And so today we're going to look at two passages, the end of Luke 16, verses 14 through 31, and then the beginning of chapter 17, verses 1 through 10. So Luke 16, verses 14 through 31. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off, and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us.' And he said, 'Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment.' But Abraham said, 'They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them.' And he said, 'No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent.' He said to him, 'If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead.'" Jesus gives a parable about money. The Pharisees react to that parable, and Jesus sees a teachable moment. What do you think?
I think my first question is, what was it about Jesus' parable that they could scoff at?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get the picture here, because these guys are obviously, for all their pride in their knowledge of the law, are completely ignoring what the law says.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just kind of wondering, what was it about the parable of the unrighteous steward that we looked at last time that they were scoffing at?
I thought the same thing, because it's not clear why they're ridiculing Jesus and what phrase or what statement they're reacting to there. You cannot serve God and money. Is that what they're reacting to? And no, I think it's all these things that they hear. It says. And so it's something in its totality. I wonder if, we have a trouble with the parable of the dishonest manager, because we want to first ask, well, how could this guy be a model of anything good?
Yeah.
And so we struggle with it, and I wonder if the Pharisees had the same struggle.
Yeah.
And Jesus often tells stories in a provocative way, because the provocative thing about him elicits a response. That's part of what parables do, is they elicit a response in their hearers. And so I wonder if that's part of Jesus' intention here, is to tell the story in such a way that it kind of catches your attention and goes, wait, that guy's the good guy in the story? How does that work?
Yeah.
And so that it gives him an opportunity now to address the deeper issue with the Pharisees.
Right.
There might be a bit of prosperity gospel aspect to it, meaning that they would think that God is actually blessing you with money, so that if you were actually serving God, you would be rich.
Right.
I mean, I think there's a little bit of that. I mean, that it's outward appearances of wealth are a sign of God's blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not wealthy, you have not served God correctly, or you're
I think that's it. I think because he says that which is highly esteemed among men, they are valuing money far above its intrinsic value. They're seeing it as you say, like a marker of God's favor, and rather than just as a tool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Jesus calls it unrighteous wealth in the parable.
Yeah.
And so he speaks to the corrupting power of wealth right there. And, unrighteous wealth, my wealth was gained righteously. My wealth is good wealth because it's a sign of God's blessing in my life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what are you talking about? And so I think Jesus is using terms and things to try to draw out how they really feel about money.
Yeah. Yeah. So how does he show them that they're not as faithful to the law as they imagine themselves? I think that, to me, this whole passage is about the error of the Pharisees and how they saw the law from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jesus just very quickly gives this overview of where they're at in redemptive history.
Right.
And that you have the law and the prophets and John the Baptist as the capstone prophet, or the final in the series of Old Testament prophets who are anticipating my coming and my kingdom. And now the kingdom is here. And I think the point there is that people are running to get into the kingdom because this is the time. This is what we've all been waiting for. But then he's quick to say, just because it's a new era in redemptive history doesn't mean that the old era is invalid.
Right.
In fact, the abiding witness of the Old Testament abides.
Yeah.
The witness of the Old Testament carries on, is not least in the ethical claims that it makes on God's people.
Yeah.
And so I think that what Jesus is getting at is, if you really knew the law, you would agree with my teaching on money.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think?
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think he's pointing out that you're going to need a savior. It's not that the kingdom kind of, we don't need to worry about the law anymore. Everybody can come in. But every part of the law needs to be fulfilled in order to qualify for the kingdom.
Right.
And if you don't fulfill it, you're going to have to find somebody who will fulfill it for you.
Yeah.
Which is, he doesn't say that, but I think he's setting them up for that you gotta know the bad news before the good news sounds good.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, he starts with, you are those who justify yourselves before men. And so that need for self-justification is driving the Pharisees in a lot of ways. And you see that again and again.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Max?
Oh, I was just going to say part of the divorce and remarriage is just the indication of how off they are in terms of interpreting the law there. And I think that was the big question mark when I read the passage. It's like, what is, the
where did that come from?
Yeah, record scratch. And yet it really is just an indication of how they become so off in their interpretation of the law.
Yeah, our English Bibles do us no help here when they put a new heading in front of verse 16 and say, and now some teaching on divorce and remarriage, as if Jesus just wanted to get in a barb about divorce and remarriage here.
Oh, and another thing.
Let's talk about divorce. Oh, and by the way, let's go back to talking about wealth now. And I think you're right that is not what's happening, because the way he frames the issue of divorce and remarriage is very specific. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another, the implication seems to be that the reason you're divorcing the woman is to marry another woman.
Yeah.
In this case. And he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. And I think he's getting at the heart issue here for the Pharisees. Remember, he just said, God knows your hearts.
Yeah.
And so even if your standard of living could be easily justified before the law, you have a heart that's full of greed and avarice, which
Right.
God hates.
Right.
And in the same way, you look at the laws on divorce and you think, what is the bare minimum I have to fulfill here in terms of my marital commitment? And so they would look at a passage like Deuteronomy 24, which gives provision for divorce. And they would interpret it in the most lax way possible to say that there could be almost any ground for divorcing my wife. And now I find a woman who's better and I want to upgrade. I will find a reason to divorce my wife over here in order to marry this woman over here. And so I can look good in the sight of men, and yet God knows my heart. And I'm really hating what God says about marriage and hating my own wife and my own marital covenant here. And I'm full of evil in the way that I'm acting, even if outwardly I look good.
Yeah. 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 You're living for yourself.
Yeah.
Under the guise of being a man of God.
Yeah. And I think there's a great caution here with wealth because there is such a temptation to use external standards of living as the indicator of whether I love money or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so because I can always find someone who lives a more opulent lifestyle than me, I can easily justify myself in the sight of men and say,
Yeah.
well, I'm not greedy.
Yeah.
I don't have those kind of things. And Jesus is really getting at, no, what has you?
Yeah, exactly. No, there are people who have very modest lifestyles who they idolize their wealth.
Yeah.
They just save it. But the point is, whether it's not the lifestyle, it's your heart. Are you trusting God? Or are you idolizing wealth as your God?
Because you can't serve both.
Yeah, you can't serve both. Right.
Yeah. So why would he tell the story of Lazarus after that? Because it's a weird parable. He doesn't even say he's telling a parable. He just tells a weird story about a rich man and Lazarus.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's a true story.
Do you want to go? Do you want to go to the Alistair well?
It sounds like, yeah. I mean, there are various ways of interpreting who Jesus is going after. I mean, Caiaphas had 5 brothers, the priest, and so there could be a not so veiled shot at the priestly class and their opulence here, which the Pharisees might very well have been coveting, even if they were a lower class. That was kind of the aim, was to get to the Sanhedrin because religion was big business in Israel.
Oh, yeah.
And the people at the top were very wealthy and lucrative because of their religious success.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think he is going after that here.
Yeah.
But I think he's also getting at the point that wealth if it impacts the way you see people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can't elevate wealth in your mind without at the same time bringing people down.
Yeah.
And seeing them as less valuable. And just as you can't serve God in money, you can't serve people in money either.
Yeah. 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 No, I think it's just interesting to me that, 5 seconds in hell turned this guy into an evangelist, and, but the point is that Jesus makes is they've got the law. Your brothers have the law. They've got everything they need to escape this place. And he says, yes, but if somebody rose from the dead, and this is kind of prophetic by Jesus. If you don't believe the law, you won't believe that somebody raises from the dead. And the only people who really take the resurrection seriously is people who know what the law says.
Right. Who see how it fits into the bigger story.
Yeah, see the whole story of the Bible.
And it's amazing how Jesus can do things on multiple levels here, because he's saying, if you knew the law, you knew what the law taught about money.
Yeah.
If you knew the law, then you wouldn't scoff at my teaching. If you knew the law, you'd also trust in me. I mean, he's bundling them all together here.
Yeah.
No.
You search the scriptures thinking that in them you have life, but it is they who testify about me. Right?
Yeah. Well, that's good.
So do you think this is an accurate description of Hades? It's not even hell. It's Hades. It's some intermediate period here before everyone's thrown into the lake of fire.
Yeah.
So It's a very vivid depiction. There's a chasm. There's Abraham. There's Abraham's bosom. There's a feast. Obviously, there's a picture of reversal here. The one who was least in the world is now the guest of honor at the table of Abraham, right? I think that's the picture, and it's a picture Jesus has used elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's your question?
How literal should we press this? I mean, in the intermediate state before Christ rose from the dead, is this how Hades worked? Is this how Sheol worked, where there was a chasm, and then, after Christ was raised, were the saints of old who are expecting Christ, are they raised up into glory with Christ? I mean, this gets into a lot of different questions about the afterlife, Dad.
I've always taken this literally.
Okay.
I've always think this is Sheol. This is the place of the dead. The place of the dead at this time was divided into the West Sheol and East Sheol. one was the place of the righteous dead. The other was the place of the unrighteous dead. And then when Jesus raises from the dead to be present, to be absent from the bodies, to be present with the Lord. And so all the righteous went up to heaven to be with the Lord because the way was now cleared for them.
Yeah.
And
but are you embodied in Sheol? Because this guy wants a drink in this disembodied state.
Well, we don't know what it's like to be disembodied. Right?
The spiritual drink that they're thirsting for.
Maybe just the agony. I don't know.
Surely there's a caution here that this is not a place that you want to go.
Yeah, exactly.
But also, I think another instructive thing is his view of Lazarus in Sheol.
Yeah.
That he knew his name.
Yeah.
He knew he was at the gate. He had no regard for him in this life. He has no regard for him in the next.
Yeah.
Send Lazarus to go do that. He still views him as a tool.
He's still himself.
He's still himself.
That's the thing. It's like Lewis in The Great Divorce. That's kind of what makes hell. You have to be you. You're still left with all of your sins and all that stuff, and that's what makes hell is that you are you, and you haven't really been redeemed.
Yeah, and an aspect of God's judgment and sin is that sin is a curving in on the self, and so you just become more of what you are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, how do you think this relates then to love of money in our lives and fleeing that? Because the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and Jesus is really getting at the heart issue here.
Yeah. I think it's because money is a false god, and it leaves us enslaved to ourselves. It cannot deliver us from our slavery to ourself, which is the real issue. And so that I just think of 1 Timothy 6, where it says, instruct those who are rich in this life not to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Yeah. That God is God, and he's the one I put my trust in. And money may come and go. Money's just a tool, and I'll be held accountable for how I used it, for good or for evil. But it's certainly not my hope.
Yeah. And also just an encouragement to those who are struggling, or those who don't have now, that it's not the only hope that you have, that there is a greater hope beyond just the material goods that you have in this life. And you can rest in that hope now and still enjoy it later.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think as you get older, this becomes, the fight of faith gets even more significant, because you think, how much money do I have? How much life do I have to live? And you can start making these extrapolations about how much I need. And if you're just living to ensure this comfortable existence in the future, well, there's a lot that Proverbs says about storing up and being wise and preparing for the future. It never says to be anxious about the future.
No.
It never says to toil after wealth. Wealth can be a byproduct of a wise life, but it isn't something to toil about. And even in the book of Proverbs, which the Pharisees could easily take as the prosperity gospel, but it's filled with admonitions about hearing the cry of the poor, reaching out your hand, being generous. That's what a righteous life looks like, is disadvantaging yourself for others. Yeah. And so they're reading one half of Proverbs and leading out the other half.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No. It's better to live in the corner of a roof than in a house with a contentious wife. There's just lots of better, and one of the betters is it's better to be poor and righteous than it is to be rich and evil.
Yep. Yeah, a house with quiet is better than a house full of feasting with strife.
Yeah. And that's true today. I mean, some of the happiest people in the world don't have anything.
Right.
But they're trusting God. And so I think we overvalue material things.
Well, you're happy when you have God. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't have anything who are pretty miserable, but because
they're materialists.
Yeah, because they're materialists. The thing is being content in all circumstances. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, whether wealthy or poor.
Yeah, and you think about losing your stuff or having your stuff stolen or all of those. It's really how you'll respond to that has to do with your heart.
Yeah.
And where that thing already is in your heart. It's a good mental exercise to say, what could I actually lose physically that would really undo me?
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, it would be really interesting in the wake of the fires to
Yeah.
do an interview of, the people that have lost everything.
Yeah.
To kind of see who amongst them are okay with what, how it
affected them.
Yeah, how that affected them and where they moved on. So some church down in Southern California should do that.
Well, I heard Mel Gibson interviewed. He lost his house.
Yeah.
He was very positive. He said, it just simplifies my life. It's great.
Yeah, but he's rich dad. I'll just live in his 14 other houses. So
yeah, that's what I was reading an article, and that was the case with most of them. I was in my house in Florida when I heard my house in Malibu was
all these empty houses.
Oh, I feel so
No, certainly not all of them, and there's a lot of heartbreaking stories there. But we mentioned that in the last podcast as well, I think. But yeah, to say that this stuff is going to evaporate, and this stuff is going to. It's not a question of if, but when, and so, and then too, I think often the way that the love of money plays out is an anxiety about the future that keeps you from continuing to reach out to people, to be generous to people, to see needs, as you kind of come more into yourself to make sure you're taken care of. And the fight of faith is just to remember that, God knows that everyone anxiously searches after these things. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. All these things will be added to you.
Yeah.
God knows what you need before you ask. And so he's going to give it to you. If you make his concerns your concerns, he's going to make your concerns his. Good. All right. Well, I think we've talked enough about that one. So let's go to Luke 17, 1 through 10. Jesus says this, and he said to his disciples, temptations to sin are sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were cast into the sea than that he should cause one of these little ones to sin. Pay attention to yourselves. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times in the day and turns to you 7 times saying, I repent, you must forgive him. The apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. And the Lord said, if you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Will any one of you who has a servant plowing or keeping sheep say to him when he has come in from the field, come at once and recline at table? Will he not rather say to him, prepare supper for me and dress properly and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you will eat and drink? Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty. Jesus addresses seemingly a few disparate issues here, but I think that they have much more in common if you look a little more deeply.
Yeah, I just wonder if this seems to be right in the context of his conversation with the Pharisee.
Yeah.
And so, because there's an and.
Mm-hmm.
And is the first word of the and he said to his disciples, and so he it's like he turns to his disciples and says, and says it's inevitable that stumbling block like these guys are going to come, but woe to him through whom they come.
Yeah, it's interesting how the issue of stumbling blocks is connected to forgiveness. And that's what I wanted to think through more, because it's not just sin, it's a stumbling block. He says that's what he's talking about, is something that would cause someone to stumble on their way to Christ.
Right.
And he says, don't cause these little ones to stumble. And little ones, it can be children, it can be people who are physically small. I think in the context of Luke's gospel, it's probably just referring to the lowly, the kind of people who come to Jesus, who are the poor, the weak, the marginalized, and the capital S sinners, right? Those are the people who are coming. and don't put a stumbling block in their way. And I think that's what the Pharisees were doing.
Yeah.
Just their lack of compassion, their hardness toward people who were bruised and weak, drove them away from Jesus, or hindered them, I would say, rather. As people are running into the kingdom and seeing the grace of Jesus, who is the barrier in their way?
Yeah.
It's the Pharisees.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then if you extend it a little more, okay, what is the Pharisaic kind of mindset that the disciples have to avoid? And I think it's a spirit of unforgiveness. It's an unwillingness to display grace to people who are clearly sinners.
Yeah, well, it's playing God. It's being judgmental of people rather than being circumspect of your own heart and realizing that you are a sinner just like them, and who are you to judge another?
Yeah. Yeah, it just strikes me that he says, pay attention to yourselves. Don't put a stumbling block. How would we put a stumbling block? It's not necessarily by sinning. It's the refusal to repair relationships and harbor unforgiveness in our hearts seems to be the actual stumbling block. What do you think? Am I off on this, Dad?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I never interpreted it that way, but I think what you say makes sense. And that's what the Pharisees were doing, are all the legalists were doing, is they had a view of God that was not consistent with truth. And so they tended to push people away from God if you don't measure up.
Yeah.
If you're not good enough, you're out of luck. And that's definitely what religion has always done. It's made God far away and hard to please. And that's just forcing people who need him away from him. Being, as you say, like a stumbling block to their faith.
And I'm amazed as I talk to people who come to Christ, how often their perception was, I thought I had to get to a certain level. I thought I had to accomplish something, achieve something, be better, and that's who church is for.
Exactly.
And that is just pervasive as I talk to people. And it's like, I feel like we're talking about grace all the time. Like I feel like and yet there's this deep-seated thing that people don't really believe that God is as forgiving and as gracious as the gospel presents him as.
Yeah, I think it's a spiritual darkness. It's like a lie that most people hear in their heads, that I have to come up to these standards before I can even darken the door of a church.
Yeah.
Like I have to get my stuff together before I can even be a part of this group. And if we, that's the great thing about regeneration. It's a great thing about a lot of recovery programs, is that people come in and have the very thing that allows you to get in there is that everyone knows that you have problems. You've got to that point where you've admitted that, and that's really helpful.
Yeah. One point that my wife brought up in our group last night, though, that I thought was really good about displaying grace is it's beautiful until you have to display it. As C.S. Lewis said, forgiveness is a beautiful idea.
Yeah.
And she just said how hard it is to actually refuse to separate from people, refuse to just kind of write people off, forgive them, address the sin, and work to repair relationship. And certainly the disciples had that thought here too, when Jesus says 7 times in a day, if your brother sins against you and repents, forgive him. And they say immediately, increase our faith. They immediately understood how costly this would be in relationships.
Yet there's so much about that where in different circumstances, like what does forgiveness look like? I mean, does it mean reparation or restoration of active relationship? There's times when there is separation that's needed, but still you can be forgiving of a person. It's like that's the question I have. What does restoration always look like? Can you forgive somebody but still not have an active relationship with them?
I think that what Jesus says here is you got to be courageous.
Yeah.
Because a gracious relationship is not hiding from the truth.
No.
Yeah.
It's your if your brother sins, rebuke him.
Yeah.
And it's also you forgive him. If he repents, you forgive him. And so what I think people tend to do now is, Christians tend to do, is we disagree with somebody's lifestyle, but we don't say anything about it. But we hold ourselves a little bit aloof from that person. And so that the way people think about God is the way they look at Christians, right? Because we're God's representatives. And so if we're not going out of our way to be initiating toward people and honest with people and just kind of in their face in a way, but we just kind of hold back like everybody else. They think, well, it must be because it might not have anything to do with, we just might be naturally shy, but people will interpret our shyness as condemnation on their lifestyle because they feel so much guilt. And so this to me is just more of an honest lifestyle of where, hey, you shouldn't do that, But
you cannot walk in grace without walking in the light.
Yeah.
They have to both be there. And I think that's often what gets missed in Jesus' command is how much courage it takes to live this way.
Yeah.
Because to forgive relationally, not just in your heart, but to actually address a wrong, you have to be willing to not let it fester, not let it hey, maybe you have to call the person. Hey, can we talk about this? This happened today. I'd like to work through this, just like in a family, right? I mean, I had to.
How many families?
Well, I mean, so in my family, like this morning, I'm short with my daughter, and there are legitimate things that I need to address with her that I think I do. But I was overbearing in the way that I went about it. And I didn't take some important contextual factors into mind. So I could see from her perspective that I'm being unrelenting in a certain way. That I'm being overbearing. And so I did. I called her and left a message on her phone at school, and hopefully I'll get to talk to her at lunch. But I think you have to model that and you have to normalize that. Here's the thing though, it stinks. It's hard in the short term. It's humbling, it's difficult, but if you don't, Ephesians 4, do not let the sun go down in your anger, do not give the devil an opportunity. He's talking about making amends in relationships there. And, I heard someone say, deal with your anger today or deal with the devil tomorrow. And I think that is
absolutely
exactly what Jesus is talking about here, that a culture of grace is one where we are eager to forgive. And so I think there's two ways to go wrong. One is we just don't address the issue. The other is that we don't give clean forgiveness. That once the issue is addressed and the person forgives, now is our chance to pile on even more on the person and dump on them. Rather than saying, I forgive you. And there's actually a restoration of warmth in the relationship. And so often, the kind of situations you're talking about, Max, where there's endangerment or something like that, I wonder how often there's a long period of, there are a lot of things that just never were addressed that needed to get addressed. And now it's gotten to a point where it's so bad. I want to be careful. That's not always the case. But this is why Scripture says it's so important to walk in grace and truth every day. Because without a proper definition of sin, there can be no forgiveness. Unless we're naming the right thing, there's no forgiveness. We're not walking in the light.
No, it's convicting for me because there's a lot of people that I know, probably a lot, who have been troublesome to me in the past. So I just stay away from them. Because it's just easier to not engage with them. And yet, do they say, and I don't think of it as being bitter toward them. I just think it as being wise in terms of who I interact with. And God says, nah, that's not it.
That's not it.
You're not showing them great. You're not showing them me.
Right. Yeah. You think about the way God engages with us and that he disciplines those who he delights in. And that there's engagement, there's truth, but there's also affection. And I think it's such a rare community that has that. And that's what Jesus is calling us to. And everyone should feel the weight of this. This is impossible in ourselves to do this.
Let's just say the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And so when we treat people kind of indifferently, or we just that's a writing off of people.
I think the disciples got that. How hard this is, because they say, increase our faith. There's no way we can do that. But what's the point of Jesus' answer?
With faith, you can do magic tricks. I think that's the point.
Nothing on my sleeve. Presto.
Well, it's an idiom for doing impossible things. That's what Jesus is describing here, which tells me that, humanly speaking, this kind of forgiveness is impossible. the kind of forgiveness we're called. It's only by faith. But it isn't about mustering up the faith to do it. It's about acting on the faith we have.
Yeah.
And that if we know the truth about God and his grace, and we respond to God, we can forgive this way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of it, he's not saying it's not an issue of how much faith you have.
Mm-hmm.
It's an issue of how much faith you use.
Right.
And if you have just a little bit of faith, it can do incredible things. So let's use what you got rather than saying, well, I can't do that because I don't have the faith to do it yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't built up my faith strong enough to really live that way. Yeah, just use what you got and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, faith isn't like in a video game where you have to store up the energy for the huge punch of faith here, right? That's not how it works.
To kill the boss.
Right, to kill the boss or something like that. No, faith is, it's faith in God, not ourselves. Yeah. And so we can make faith this sort of virtue that we have to such an extent that it becomes this superpower. And it's like, no, we in ourselves, we have nothing. It's what do we know to be true about God, and are we going to act like that's true?
Yeah, yeah. And if you just act, he gives you the power to do it.
Right.
It's not, and I think that's why he goes on with the whole thing of the slave and don't congratulate yourself for living by faith.
Yeah.
Because you're just doing what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. And I actually, though the parable might seem hard to our ears, I think there's something totally liberating about this to say that if he is the Lord of the universe and the master and he tells me to do something, I'm not doing some amazing special favor to him by obeying him.
Yeah.
Especially when, Jesus is telling us how we should view ourselves as servants. He isn't telling us how the master treats us here, right? That's not the point of the parable.
No.
The point of the parable is this is how a servant thinks.
How you view yourself.
Yeah, how you view yourself, not how the master is going to treat you. We already know from Luke 12, Jesus talks about the master serving his servants at the table and Jesus demonstrating that. The point is, from my perspective as a servant, I am not putting God in my debt. I am not doing him a big favor by obeying him. It's the least I can do. Yeah. And actually, that has been so freeing to me when I'm struggling to forgive, is to remember his total authority over my life and that I belong to him. And so it has nothing to do with the other person, why I'm going to forgive. It has everything to do with God and just saying, yes, sir, I'm going to forgive them. This is my duty. And that actually, and then when you bring in the by faith part of you have been forgiven and the master has forgiven you and the broader teaching of the New Testament, then it's just who am I? Who am I? What right do I have to withhold forgiveness when I have been forgiven greatly by God?
Yeah. Yeah, we don't earn God's blessings. All of God's blessings are by grace. Yeah. But we obey him because he's God.
Right.
And it's keeping those things separate.
Well, when he's saying, we are unworthy servants, it foreshadows the talk that you just gave, about the tax collector, kneeling before God, just saying, I am, a sinner unworthy.
Mm-hmm.
That aspect of just acknowledging your own sin is it will, exactly. It helps you really to forgive people quicker.
Yeah, as long as you're living in comparison land, you're not living by faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I've often thought so many of our issues in life come down to, am I responding to God or reacting to people?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I was confessing sin a few days ago, and I realized, and I was thinking about Psalm 66:18, where David says, if I cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, where am I cherishing iniquity in my heart? And so often I feel entitled to feel a certain way about people or think a certain way about people because da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I cherish those little thoughts in my head. And I just realized there's no place for that.
Yeah.
There's no place. I'm not responding to God in the way that I'm viewing these people.
Yeah.
I'm leaving him completely out of the equation. And so
Yeah.
it was really helpful in confession to just say, I am not entitled to think this way about this person. I'm not entitled to have this feeling toward this person. I'm not entitled to harbor this toward this person, right? And to write those out. And it was amazing as you confess that the grip of those things begins to lose its power.
Yeah.
And you're able to really forgive from the heart.
Yeah.
As you just realize that you're not responding to God here, Jeff.
Yeah.
There's a third party involved here that you're not taking into account.
Yeah. That's good. Like Paul says, God's slave is free. You know,
Amen.
it's if you be, the more enslaved to God you become, and let Him make all these things, the freer you become of all these things.
Yeah, I think of what Paul says in Galatians 5, where he says, it is for freedom that you've been set free, but then do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but in love serve one another. Literally, in love, be slaves of one another.
Yeah.
And so it's this idea of when I see my duty to God and to people, then I'm free.
Yeah.
That's real freedom, because I can either be enslaved to my passions and to my sin, or enslaved to God.
Yeah.
That's good. That's really good.
Well, good stuff, guys.
Thanks, Jeff. Good.
Thank you, listeners. We'll keep trying to catch up to get current. So appreciate your patience as we do that. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you again soon.